About 2 years ago, I made a video discussing why I didn't fully agree with the seeming consensus that Steel Ball Run Part 7 is the best arc in JoJo's, asking the question, is Steel Ball Run really as good as people think? And I received a great deal of constructive comments, such as, yes, or go fuck yourself. And it's fair to say that the like to dislike ratio is less than satisfactory, but I always knew that that would be the case. Of course, when someone who's a nobody on YouTube makes a video telling the vast majority of people they disagree with their opinion, it will attract vitriol. That's no surprise. And for a good amount of time, I considered making a response video to some of the more well thought out comment responses to address those points I'd overlooked in the video itself, or to reinforce my opinion. But for one reason or another, that never came to be. Now, however, is the right time. But I'm not going to be addressing responses because something has changed. I spent the last few days rereading Steel Ball Run, not out of an initial desire to make this video, but simply because I'm very much enjoying the adaptation of Part 5 and I felt a desire for more JoJo content. So I figured that rereading the part that my opinion was very controversial on might be prudent, and I was very, very right. If you haven't watched the original video, I recommend doing so now, partially because there are aspects of it that I stand by, and partially for comparison with my updated opinion. Johnny had indeed been a bit of an arsehole in the past, like I said, but he got his comeuppance before the story began. He was shot and paralysed, and as retribution goes, that's pretty major. Johnny had learned his lesson and wanted to repent. He clearly regretted what he did fairly strongly. I had trouble sympathising with his motivation, because I thought it was selfish and basically not righteous, which isn't inherently wrong to feel, but I felt this way because I perceived Johnny as obnoxious and unlikable, which he most certainly isn't. He's one of the most genuine feeling JoJos and is basically just a kid. I was correct to mention his self-interest, but I mistakenly attributed this to selfishness. Johnny is not selfish, he's merely looking out for himself, and it would be odd if he weren't. Moreover, my claims that Johnny's paralysis could be symbolic of his egocentrism but isn't are just wrong. How I managed to spot this symbolism and then discount it so readily is beyond me, but Johnny being paralysed is most definitely a metaphor for his immaturity in the beginning of the part, and it's made explicitly clear from the opening and closing lines that learning to walk again is something with multiple meanings, and that Johnny earns his walking from his redemption arc where he grows as a person, thereby making the number one theme that Araki has stated of an affirmation that humanity is wonderful shown here arguably better than any other part. I also originally implied that Johnny was somehow responsible for Gyro's death with his selfishness, and that's obviously not the case, and Gyro himself is a flawed person. That's why he dies, and to say it's Johnny's fault, or at the very least linked to Johnny's actions, is to discount the complexity of Gyro's arc. As I stated originally, Johnny is an interesting, deep character, but having reread the part, I now realise that on top of all this, he's a thematically perfect addition to the cast, exemplifying the themes of the part and the series as a whole with unparalleled aptitude, and is one of Araki's greatest triumphs of a character. It's clear I misread his character and for whatever reason didn't really get on well with his humour and sometimes his juvenile personality, but on second read I found him to be fun, enjoyable to be in the company of, but a serious driven character when it came down to it. Moving on, my assessment of Funny Valentine is perhaps the worst and most inaccurate part of the video due to one simple mistake I made when reading the part for the first time, but I'll get there shortly. I was correct in my understanding that Valentine is a patriot, obviously, otherwise it's doubtful he'd become president in the first place, and I read this patriotism as a positive, tying it intrinsically to saving and improving the lives of innocents, which is not necessarily not something he would do, but I was obviously going for an ends justify the means point, which isn't really applicable here since I didn't correctly interpret Valentine's ends. The point of his character arc is to show that his patriotism runs so deep that it becomes nationalism and ultimately xenophobia. His final ability Love Train reflects that perfectly. He's a president who believes himself righteous and his country the most important, so it redirects misfortune elsewhere. Very fitting, and the social relevance Araki tapped into in this part is not to be understated, and in today's political climate is more relevant than ever. This time around, I love the politics in this part because I correctly interpreted what they were meant to imply instead of believing that any patriot in office is automatically good. That's highly reductionist, and perhaps there's something to be said for my interactions with real-world politics shaping my understanding more accurately now, but who knows for sure. All I know is that on first read I gravely misunderstood his intentions, which leads me on to proclaiming he had noble goals. On top of this, Valentine is shown to be a cold person in general, which just conflicted with his overall noble goals. When I made the statement that his goals were noble, I had one particular interaction in mind. When he bargains with Johnny in the final fight, explaining his patriotism and integrity to uphold deals like he had by not killing Steven Steele. Whilst this is true, it's entirely undermined by how the fight ends. Johnny throws him the revolver that was used to kill Gyro and tells him to pick it up, as a test to ensure that the infinite spin had stopped, but it's then implied that his real motivation was to see if Valentine was concealing the same gun from another universe, which is indeed the case. I somehow missed this point of the action. I don't really understand how this happened, and this is the mistake I was referencing earlier. By not noticing this, it means that I was free to interpret everything Valentine said as true and not see any evidence to the contrary, when in reality Valentine was lying to Johnny just so he could kill him, thus undermining every promise he made. It's the perfect end for a crooked politician. He attempts, in the face of death, to make one last deal, one last compromise, and weasel his way out of punishment, but Johnny won't let that happen. He's seen through the obfuscation the president is willing to attempt just to his own ends, and he kills him there and then. In summary, by missing this crucial detail, I massively misinterpreted the intentions behind Valentine, which understandably led me to see the part as morally confused, when really it was pretty obvious what it was saying. Yes, the morality is not black and white, but that is not equivalent to lacking good and evil. Not only this, I claim that there was no personal link between protagonist and antagonist, like in other parts, and while this is sort of true, it's not particularly a criticism. Johnny and Gyro are not the first to attack, so all of their fights are acts of self-defense, and ultimately this evolves into Johnny's common decency outweighing patriotism that knows an America better off under Valentine means a worse off rest of the world, something which Valentine obviously does not have the right to claim. On that point also, I, for some reason, believe that the USA would be better off under Valentine with the corpse. It's possible that this is true given his patriotism and nationalism, but really, is a man willing to kill his own innocent civilians for what he believes to be the greater good likely to be a safe man in the White House? It seems likely that he would wage war on other countries if he believed there was something in it for him, and given that he acts according only to his own whims and power-hungry nature, he would probably be borderline despotic. We of course have no way of knowing, but given his nature, America would very likely not be better off having Valentine with the corpse as president. The final major mistake I made was to talk about Tusk Act 4 and Ballbreaker being Deus Ex Machina abilities, and while they sort of are, that's not really out of the ordinary for JoJo. In my part 5 video, I spent about 25 minutes talking about how important the concept of fate is for the stories Araki tells, and yet here I had a hard time accepting it. Really though, I think this was just me wanting a platform to defend part 5. The spin clearly foreshadows and leads directly up to those two abilities. It's convenient that it occurs in their hour of need, but it ultimately makes a lot of sense and was nowhere near as jarring as I tried to make it appear. I actually still prefer the subtler foreshadowing utilised in part 5, but unlike how I presented it back then, I now understand that both parts have well-built endings. These problems with my thematic analysis seem to come from the way that I considered Steel Ball Run in isolation and not as a story arc within a bigger picture, but having reread it and with the context I have as a JoJo fan now, it's clear that it's really not out of character for JoJo and exemplifies many themes better than some of the early parts do. As a final note, everything I liked about the part originally still stands. I love the creativity and the weapon of the steel balls, and there are standout arcs like True Man's World and Wrecking Ball which truly are excellent. And the part provokes thought and political discourse, something which is brave of Araki to attempt in a series such as this, but honestly I now realise how tastefully and effectively this is executed, owing largely to his trademark attention to detail alongside a grand scale adventure. Part 7 is still not my favourite, mind you, and there are legitimate criticisms I could level against it, but it stands among the best, and certain elements are the best the series has ever seen. So yes, Steel Ball Run probably is as good as people say. It just took me 2 extra years to understand why.